afternoon and welcome. My name is Monica Murray, and I am the Public Programming Officer at the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORIS. DORIS houses the city's municipal archives and library and is focused on fostering civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary record of the New York City government and its people. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, A Home Away from Home. I'll quickly introduce today's speaker and then pass it to her to begin the presentation. Tyesha Maddox is an associate professor at Fordham University in the Department of African and African American Studies. She earned her PhD in history from New York University in 2016 and holds a BA and an MPS in Africana Studies from Cornell University, completed in 2006 and 2008, respectively. In 2020, she co-edited a comprehensive resource guide and website titled "This Is Not a Riot" to help contextualize the Black Lives Matter uprising of 2020 and place them in the historical radical tradition of Black protests in the US. She also serves as a key organizer for Mutual Aid NYC's Organizing Archive and Library, as well as her Public History and Political Education Committee. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tyesha Maddox.
Thank you so much for all of you having me here today, especially since it's so hot. I wanted to remind everyone before we start that it is primary day, so please make sure you go out and vote. The polls close, I believe, at 9 p.m. today. So thank you again for having me. I wanted to start the talk by talking about my book, A Home Away from Home. And this book itself has been a culmination of many years of work on these specific, I think, very significant Caribbean mutual aid societies. So let me share my screen. Oh, perfect. So as I was saying, this book is the culmination of many years of work on these really significant networks of Caribbean mutual aid societies in New York City. And while my research focuses on New York City, the book itself maintains a bilateral gaze on the United States and the Caribbean in order to highlight the very transnational nature of this group of Caribbean immigrants who traveled to America. The first two chapters of the book take place in the Caribbean in order to highlight the origins of U.S. mutual aid societies and benevolent associations, as well as to provide a more holistic understanding of the Caribbean immigrants that would eventually form these American social organizations. The final 3 chapters take place in the US, but highlight the ways in which Caribbean immigrants continue to engage with the Caribbean region. Gender, race, class are all important themes that permeate throughout the book, with specific attention paid to the importance of female immigrants in every chapter. And so this first picture is an expanded version of the book's picture that highlight a group of Caribbean women from the French Caribbean, from the island of Guadeloupe, who came to Ellis Island. That's the Ellis Island Processing Center in the back in 1911. So I think it's appropriate that I'm here today. As many of you are aware, the month of June marks National Caribbean American Heritage Month here in the United States. And it recognizes the historic relationship between the people of the Caribbean and the people of the United States, as well as the many contributions of Caribbean immigrants and their descendants to the well-being of America. Caribbean immigrants from all over the Caribbean basin have established a place for themselves in the United States by developing their own communities and sociocultural infrastructure, becoming involved in politics, and sharing their cultures. Without their contributions, America would not be the rich, culturally diverse place that it is today. And as such, Caribbean people have made lasting contributions to the fabric of American society and history, changing the political, economic, and social landscape of Black life in the United States. And in doing so, they have left indelibly their mark on American history. It's very hard to imagine an America without these contributions of Caribbean immigrants. So I like to start my talk today with a little vignette about one of the many Caribbean women that I discuss within the book. And the woman's name is Mary Lane. And so this picture that I'm showing marks her movement from the island of Barbados to Panama and then on to New York. In the book, I talk about the ways in which many Caribbean people had very circuitous routes in which they took for immigration. And so Mary's Lane is one story of the way in which some Caribbean women moved throughout the Caribbean basin first before they eventually arrived in the United States. So on June 10th, 1919, Mary Lane, a 41-year-old native of Barbados, arrived in New York City on the SS Tees operated by the United Fruit Company. Because she was illiterate, Lane was initially excluded from entering the United States at a time when literacy was one of the major requirements for the admission of immigrants. She was later granted temporary admission and placed on a $300 bond for 1 year because she was the domestic servant and child care provider of Margaret and C.F. McMurray, an American company living in Cologne, Panama. Margaret was the daughter of John C. Horder of Nutley, New Jersey, who was a sugar broker in New York. Horder had used his influence with the U.S. Secretary of Labor to allow Lane to enter the U.S. in 1919 with his daughter, who would be traveling alone with her small children and would need Lane's assistance. Prior to her employment with the McMurrays, Lane had been living and working in Panama for a total of 9 years. It's unclear, but these are around the times in which the building of the canal had begun. And so it's pretty obvious or pretty sure that Lane was doing some kind of secondary work to the building of the canal and supporting some of those male workers. She herself had been widowed in 1908, and the death of her husband may have been one of the factors that sparked her move to Panama, a country where she had no family or connections. Lane did, however, have a daughter named Ann Pounder, who had been living in Harlem, New York for 3 years. Pounder had invited her mother to the United States on numerous occasions, offering to pay her passage from Panama. In 1920, when her mother was granted a 1-year stay in the US to work with the McMurrays, Pounder tried as hard as she could to have her mother's stay extended. The Board of Special Inquiry held at Ellis Island records the following exchange between officials and the mother and daughter. Quote, "Her daughter desires her to remain and is ready to take care of her at any time, although it is the alien's intention to work and support herself, which she is able to do. Destined to her daughter, she may be exempted from the literacy test, which appears to be the only ground for exclusion." End quote. Ellis Island officials asked Pounder, quote, "What would you be willing to do for your mother?" End quote. She responded, "Anything I am called upon to do. I am an only child." End quote. Lane was then asked how long she intended to stay and responded, "As long as my daughter is here." Lane was eventually allowed to remain in New York with her daughter. McMurray, her employer, moved back to Panama without her. And so Mary's story and narrative demonstrates the reality of many immigrants' mobility within the Caribbean. It also demonstrates this idea of female-led chains of immigration that occur in the US, and I talk about more in the book. And then, of course, the various labor roles available for Caribbean immigrants to come, and which entice them to come to the United States. So between the years 1890 and 1940, just over 355,000 Caribbean immigrants came to the US. They flooded into cities such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. However, historically, New York City has served as a central port of entry for Caribbean immigrants, with steamships carrying both tourists and imports between New York and the West Indies. Caribbean immigrants lived in other regions of the US, such as the South and the West, but there was no location akin to the Northeast and New York in particular for Caribbean immigrants with respect to concentration. By 1950, over 79% of immigrants from the British West Indies lived in the Northeast and 70% in the state of New York. The earliest Caribbean immigrants first established scattered communities in Lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn. After 1915, they, along with African Americans, began to move into the Harlem community of Northern Manhattan, as it provided opportunities to purchase property at more affordable rates than in other areas of Manhattan. This lasted until the late 1930s and 40s, when Caribbean immigrants began to move out of Harlem and into Brooklyn. The famed Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s brought with it increased rent prices, overcrowding housing conditions, and various health concerns for residents of Harlem. The Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, with greater opportunities for affordable homeownership, attracted new Caribbean immigrants. In the late 1960s and 70s, the Caribbean community, again seeking increased opportunity for low-cost homeownership, began to move from Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights into the surrounding neighborhoods of Flatbush and East Flatbush, and even further into Brownsville and Canarsie. Caribbean immigrants, with their growing numbers, soon would make up the largest singular group of immigrants from one region in New York City. Interestingly, New York City's immigrant population is just over 3 million, a number which would comprise the third largest city in the United States. So here's a little bit of data about more recent data, since my book looks at an earlier period, but I wanted to throw in some more recent data. And as a historian from 2011, that is recent for me. But nations from the Caribbean make up half of the top 10 countries of origins of New York City's immigrant population, with immigrants from the non-Hispanic Caribbean making up 20% of New York City's foreign-born population. The largest group of New York City's immigrant population hails from the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, followed by Guyana, Haiti, and then immigrants from Trinidad and Tobago. And important to note that these numbers do not include the number of second and third generation children of Caribbean immigrants born in the United States. If it did, then that would triple these numbers. And so we'd have an even larger number of Caribbean people of Caribbean descent listed. Approximately 6 out of 10 New Yorkers are either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. So we know this is a huge, huge number within our cities, 60%. Fun fact, 48%, when we think of immigration, especially recently, we tend to think of immigration from Central and South America, but actually 48% of all Black immigrants in the US hail from the Caribbean. So this is a pretty large number coming from such a small region. But what did these people do once they arrived here in the US? I'll talk a little bit about some of the labor roles that they took. So in the early 20th century, many Caribbean immigrants that came to the United States were skilled and professional workers. However, due to racist hiring practices that would not allow Black people to break into certain fields, many were not able to secure positions in their trained professions. As a result, many Caribbean women, such as Mary Lane, took positions as domestics and caregivers. They also worked in garment and healthcare, in the garment and healthcare industries. For Caribbean men, the United States military also provided viable employment opportunities, and employment in the US military was not only a secure source of income, but in many cases, it allowed immigrants to obtain American citizenship. Also pictured at the bottom corner, we see a Caribbean man who is an elevator operator. And so that was also a very popular job. Jobs that allowed people to get a pension or have some kind of secure state were ones that Caribbean immigrants often sought out. So working for the post office, or that was also a highly coveted job for many Caribbean immigrants, or any other kind of federal job at the time. In addition, Caribbean immigrants experimented with various business ventures. Since they were often not allowed to take on their trained professions, they created opportunities for themselves. And so they experimented with ventures such as tailor shops and jewelry stores, fruit and vegetable stands, candy shops, and grocery stores, all within Black neighborhoods. One example of this is in 1925, a Montserratian-born William H. Roach owned and operated the only Black casino and moving picture theater in Harlem, called the Renaissance Theater and Casino. It was located at the northeast corner of 137th Street and 7th Avenue, and Roach bought the lot for the Renaissance complex in 1920. Together with another fellow Montserratian, Joseph H. Sweeney, and an Antiguan businessman, Cleophas Charity, the three built the 900-seat Renaissance Theater in 1921. The theater featured films and stage performances, and it was nicknamed the Rennie. The Renaissance would become a hotspot in Harlem, and musicians such as Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Count Basie all performed there. It also hosted fights with the legendary boxer Joe Louis, and the Renaissance became home court for the Black Fives, also known as the Harlem Wrens, an all-Black professional basketball team established in 1923. The Renaissance hosted the Harlem Wrens at a time when Black athletes, if you can imagine, were barred from participating in the National Basketball Association. Another area of work that was really helpful for Caribbean immigrants was agricultural work. And we see this post the 1940s, particularly when an influx of Caribbean immigrants to the United States came. And this was due to two things. One, the loosening of restrictive immigration laws that had been put into place after World War I. And it also had to do with the United States participation in World War II and needing workers to come to the US. So, and continuing into the modern era, this idea of this entrepreneurial spirit, Caribbean immigrants continue to bring these traditions of home and their entrepreneurial efforts with them. A current example is in 1980, when there was a mass transit strike that halted all New York City buses and subways throughout the 5 boroughs. Caribbean residents, borrowing from a tradition of minivan-style public transportation seen in many islands in the Caribbean, including ZR vans in Barbados or maxi taxis in Trinidad and Tobago, they started using their own cars and vans to drive passengers to their destinations. 11 days after the strike ended, the van service, which had become widely popular, remained in operation. The drivers eventually would expand their businesses using passenger vans to create routes in places like Crown Heights, Flatbush, and Jamaica, Queens, and Far Rockaway, and also downtown Brooklyn. Named the Dollar Van because they charged a competing $1 rate for service. I wish they were still charging $1. This form of transportation became a big part of life in Caribbean sections of Brooklyn and Queens, where mass transit did not exist. Moving into more contemporary times, we see a plethora of Caribbean entrepreneurial endeavors with Caribbean restaurants, bakeries, newspapers, shops, and festivals, which can now be found throughout the entire New York metro area. Caribbean businesses play an important role as not only forms of self-employment and entrepreneurship for Caribbean immigrants in New York, but also as markers of Caribbean ethnicity. These businesses are key sites for the Caribbean immigrant experience in New York, and they provide services and products that help Caribbean immigrants adapt to living in the city. Also very important, I'm going to take it back historically and look at these Caribbean mutual aid societies, which also were really helpful in helping Caribbean immigrants adapt to living in the United States. These mutual aid societies and benevolent associations. So my work, the book, A Home Away from Home, investigates the archival records of 66 mutual aid societies and benevolent associations that were founded in New York City between 1890 and 1940. These associations heightened a sense of West Indian ethnic identity amongst Caribbean immigrants in the US and played a vital role in the formation of Caribbean immigrant transnational identity. They also helped facilitate in community building. By utilizing this understudied lens of analysis, Caribbean immigrant mutual aid societies and benevolent associations, a more nuanced understanding of the way in which Caribbean immigrant groups were able to conceptualize their identities as Black people in the United States and as a West Indian immigrant group, and ultimately how they came to perceive of themselves as a transnational group of people that were connected to the African diaspora, is explored throughout the text. So a question many of you might have is, what is mutual aid? What is a mutual aid society? And so it's a buzzword that we've seen recently, but this concept of mutual aid is not new. While it may seem like mutual aid organizing is new, given the boom in mutual aid groups that were established in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. So for instance, in New York City alone, There were over 150 local mutual aid groups, ranging from groups that were organized around neighborhoods to those that were specifically for economically disadvantaged minorities or LGBTQIA plus people. These were established in the 4 months since the city came to a frightening standstill in March 2020. However, mutual aid has been a mainstay in communities that have often been abandoned or marginalized by government institutions. These communities have historically been immigrant and minority. Moreover, mutual aid has always been inextricable to effective social movements, as mutual aid is inherently political, because it brings marginalized people together to support one another and to ultimately demand their rights and move towards a vision of a better world. So on a very basic level, a mutual aid ideology is one in which a group of people work together to implement collective strategies and pool resources together to meet the needs of that select group when there's a lack of governmental assistance. These resources can include food, clothing, housing, medical care, monetary assistance, and historically have included burial and sick insurance, such as the case as the mutual aid societies that I look at in my work. These groups function as interstitial social mechanisms, filling in the gaps between the major institutions of society and easing the strains of the system. More recently, scholars and activists have come to define mutual aid as a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions, not just through symbolic acts or putting pressure on their representatives in government, but by actually building new social relations that are more survivable. At its core, mutual aid exposes the failures of the current system and shows an alternative, as scholar and activist Dean Spade states. It builds a faith in people power and fights the demobilizing impacts of individualism and hopelessness-induced apathy. Mutual aid projects build solidarity, skills for collaboration, participation, and decision-making. In short, mutual aid is both a form of self-preservation and political action. And so this is where these Caribbean mutual aid groups, the history of these groups come from. Mutual assistance and self-help have been the cornerstone of minority and immigrant communities for generations. In my own research, again, I examined these early 20th century Caribbean immigrant groups to New York, who relied very heavily on these mutual aid practices. And these practices were practices that they took with them from the Caribbean. Post-emancipation in the Caribbean, there was a boom in what were called friendly societies. And these friendly societies were the precursors to what would become the Immigrant Mutual Aid and Benevolent Association. The friendly societies were established at a time where formerly enslaved people were left to their own. They had to find housing, they had to find jobs, they had to find ways in which to feed their families. And so many of these immigrants, many of these Caribbean newly freed people came together to form these mutual aid organizations called friendly societies. There were various groups, many of them developed in urban areas within the Caribbean, and they used these organizations to secure a better life for themselves post-slavery in the Caribbean. Once Caribbean people began to immigrate outside of the Caribbean to places such as New York, Central America, particularly to work on the Panama Canal, and to London in the UK, we see the establishment of foreign mutual aid practices. And so these organizations sometimes would take on the full exact structure of the friendly society and just place it within the US, or sometimes, as in the case of the Bermuda Benevolent Association, whose building I have highlighted here, they would form something completely new for themselves. And they would take the practices of these organizations, but create something new for themselves. And so in my own research, I examined early 20th century Caribbean immigrants to New York who relied very heavily on these mutual aid practices. As Caribbean immigrants poured into New York City at the turn of the 20th century, they looked for ways in which to provide support for each other. As the US government had very few programs to assist immigrants, least of all non-white English-speaking immigrants, who the people that I study in my book are, mostly from the Anglophone Caribbean, who were part of the British Empire at the time still. So these people coming into an unfamiliar city, often with very few networks, they relied on the mutual aid practices that they had brought with them from the Caribbean to provide networks of kinship and support. And the immediate reaction of these newly arrived immigrants was to reach out to each other for support and protection against a hostile environment. The first known Caribbean immigrant society in New York was the West Indian Benevolence Association of New York City, which was founded in 1884. And it serves as a forum for discussions on Caribbean American affairs. They hosted cultural activities and provided newly arrived immigrants with various forms of support, including job and housing assistance. They had rotating lines of credit, often called either a susu or a box or a partner, that allowed the organization to pool the collective money of the members in order to buy buildings for themselves, such as the one located here, or to provide scholarships or assistance to their members. They also helped members in the naturalization process, as many of the members began to obtain US citizenship. And then its most popular function, which was a carryover from the friendly societies, was the sick and burial assistance. And so the idea of proper burial or respectful burial is one that carried over as a tradition from friendly societies in the Caribbean. And they brought these ideas with them. Many of these organizations also served as kind of like early insurance policies for members, where if a member got sick or ill and couldn't work, the organization would pay them out an amount of money, like a determined amount of money for the time that they were sick. Similarly, if a member died, then the organization would pay for their burial. I think this is a corrective to the injustices of the system of enslavement, where many enslaved people were not properly buried and were not honored in the traditional ways in which they would have been within the African continent. And so these societies filled in this need for many Caribbean immigrants. Moreover, these organizations served as gateways for Caribbean immigrants to enter and settle into their new lives in the United States by providing members with a ready-made social network, teaching them the ways of the city, and in one of the books that I found within one of the organizations, teaching them how to be good Americans and what that meant to be in America, as well as helping them stay connected to their identities. So some of the functions of these organizations, as I mentioned, are the sick and burial organizations, or the sick and burial function of these organizations. And so as part of that, many of the organizations would have what they called a visiting committee. So if someone got sick, someone or a group from the visiting committee would go to the hospital and visit that member to make sure they were okay. They would bring them flowers or cards. They would also pay out the amount of money that they would receive not being able to work. And so providing this kind of intimate connection for many Caribbean immigrants was something that was really special and helpful. Many of these Caribbean immigrants were young people. They were often single, or if they were married, they were often separated from their spouse. Sometimes they had to leave their children home. And so having this kind of close kinship ties with the organization made it feel closer for them to be in this unfamiliar place by themselves. And in many cases, they didn't feel by themselves. I throughout the book, I interview some more recent members of friendly societies. And one of the members, her name is Ivy Simons. She was part of the Bermuda Benevolent Association in the 1940s and 50s. And she told me that she came to New York as a very young girl. She was 18. She had two aunts and an uncle who were here. And she was introduced to the Bermuda Benevolent Association through her aunt's participation in the organization. She said before that she had not known anyone else in New York City, and having membership within the organization helped her feel more at home in the city, gave her a ready-made social network. It also allowed her to practice some of her political leanings. And so Ivy Simons herself would go on to become treasurer of the organization. She would go on to eventually become vice president and then president of the organization. And then she also joined a couple other related organizations to that organization. And so I think it was really special that many of these organizations were not only ways in which Caribbean immigrants could find social connection, but it also gave them in many ways a political platform. It gave them networks of people for themselves. Another really important aspect of the organizations were the juvenile groups. Many of the organizations initially started off as being for adult immigrants, but as people began to settle in the US and have children, they expanded their functions to adapt to the growing needs of their members. And so Caribbean immigrants, or many of these Caribbean groups, form juvenile organizations. So for instance, there's a group called the Montserrat Progressive Society Juvenile. And within this group, they were supervised by members of the older group, but they allowed the juvenile members ages, I believe it was from age 6 until 16. And then they would then move on to the adult group. But I think these groups were really important, one, because they kept the children of these Caribbean immigrants in tune to their own Caribbean identities and traditions. They also allowed the children to practice the functions of the organizations, which would keep them interested in the organizations, and then they would eventually move on to become full-fledged members of the adult organizations. And so this was a way to keep younger members interested in the organization, for them to learn about the Caribbean heritage and these traditions. But then it also was a great way for them to recruit new members to come into the organization. They were making for themselves a ready-made group. Also really important in these organizations were the women who were part of these organizations. And so as you can see in this picture, this first picture here with the various members, while many of these organizations were sometimes led by men, we can see from this one committee, this is one of the executive committees of the Bermuda Benevolent Association. We can see that more than half of the members are women. And so women were very instrumental in these organizations, in running them, in creating a lot of the programming. And so some of the programming that they would create, not only were there social functions where they would play bidwis or they would have Caribbean dances or Caribbean Heritage Night that highlighted the various islands in which they were from. But they also had historical, really important historical debates. They'd have lectures, they'd have politicians who would come to their meetings and talk to members. And so many of the people who were instrumental in running these organizations were women. Also, here we have one of the first women vice presidents of an organization. Her name was Edith Gilbert Hawkins. And so she's pictured here as well. We can also see, here's an example of a membership card from the Antigua Progressive Society. And so we can see that this is the application of Lucy George. And she has no occupation, so that probably means she was a homemaker. and it lists the name of her beneficiary, the relationship of that beneficiary. And so these applications, I have records of a ton of these, show the various types of people who join these organizations. And one would think that many of these organizations would have a social, like a certain social class, but from looking at the membership records, you had all kinds of Caribbean immigrants who were part of these organizations, from students to homemakers to people who were entrepreneurs and had their own businesses. And so we see various socioeconomic representation amongst these organizations. And so these Caribbean immigrant mutual aid societies were really helpful for various reasons. They provided immigrants they served many purposes for Caribbean immigrants living in the United States. And many of them took advantage of these memberships. Another important aspect of these organizations, many of the organizations would pull the money of the dues that were paid in order to buy a building. And so there was a point in time when many of these organizations had buildings within like places such as Harlem. Now there are very few that are still in existence. The Antigua Progressive Society, which is now the Antigua and Barbuda Progressive Society, is one of the few remaining organizations from this early period that still have their building. The one I have listed here is the Bermuda Benevolent Association building. And unfortunately, they had to sell their building back in the late 1990s. But their organizations, such as the Antigua Progressive Society, that still has their building, the St. Lucia United, they also still have their building. However, they moved. So they used to be in Harlem, which was where the concentration of many of these organizations were. And they end up moving their building to Brooklyn. And so now they still have their building and their headquarters, but it's located in Brooklyn. But as you can see here from the Bermuda Benevolent Association, these headquarters or homes served as places where Caribbean immigrants could come together and form community for themselves. On the door of the building, it's labeled home, which I think shows the importance of these societies to Caribbean immigrants. In speaking with the woman that I mentioned earlier, Ivy Simons, who would eventually go on to serve as in every executive board position for the Bermuda Benevolent Association, she told me that the society for her felt like a home away from home. And so that's where the title of the book comes from that conversation that I had with Ms. Simons some years ago. And so these organizations, I believe, are really important in how we think about this earlier period of Caribbean immigration, the ways in which Caribbean immigrant communities form, because many of these people who come from the Caribbean do not initially see themselves as Caribbean immigrants. They see themselves as Jamaican or St. Lucian or Martinican, but they don't necessarily see themselves as Caribbean. And so these organizations are ways in which they can come together as Caribbean immigrants. So through their involvement in these social organizations, Caribbean immigrants not only demonstrate that they want to be part of a larger Caribbean immigrant community, but it also provided a nuanced way for understanding the way in which these Caribbean immigrants were able to conceptualize their evolving identity as Caribbean. It also was really helpful because many of these Caribbean immigrants were also at the same time developing a Black African American identity. And so we have lots of cooperation between these Caribbean immigrant mutual aid societies and benevolent associations and African American groups. And so we see groups such as the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porter, which was one of the largest Black unions, working in conjunction with these mutual aid societies. We have members of these Caribbean immigrant societies also participating in African American groups. And so there was a lot of cross cooperation. So at the same time that they were understanding themselves as Caribbean or Caribbean immigrants, they were also conceptualizing themselves as Black people in America with this African American group. And so I think this is a great way to look at the ways in which Black identity is a multiplicity of things, and a way in which we see that Black identity is not just one standard thing. And so in this Caribbean Heritage Month, I want us to take this idea with us that Blackness is many things, that Caribbean immigrants are a significant, play a significant part in the history of America, in the history of this city, and many of the ways in which we think about Caribbean or New York history is closely linked and tied to these immigration of people from the Caribbean. So thank you all very much. And I guess I will take questions now.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Maddox. I'm Latanya Jones. I'm Director of External Affairs, and I will lead us through the Q&A. We got a lot of questions around the origin of the project for you and a bit about your research. So can you share what drew you to discussing Caribbean American mutual aid societies? Was there a particular archive or story or person that first sparked this interest?
Thank you so much for that question. Actually, that's like the perfect question. I should have led with that. My mom is a immigrant from the Caribbean, so that was my own personal connection. My mom is from St. Lucia, and she came to New York in her teen years. I won't say when it was, but she came to New York in her teen years to go to high school, and she met my dad, who is African American. His family's from New York, but they were also migrants themselves. They migrated, my grandparents, respectively, my grandmother from North Carolina and my grandfather from South Carolina. And so they immigrated to New York also. And so I was always really interested in this idea of movement and why people move and where they're going, how they develop community and things like that. And so when I was in my master's program, I was like, I'm going to write a book on Caribbean and African American social interactions and like how we become Black and what that means. And so I did a lot of research at the Schomburg, which is an awesome site for any kind of study you're doing on people of the African diaspora. So I went to the Schomburg with nothing, and it's just like, this is what I'm thinking about. And I just kept coming across these mutual aid societies. I had not heard of them before. And so I was really surprised because one, I had not really heard of them before. And there were so many of them. And they just kept coming up in the records. And I was like, oh, these must be really important. And as I was reading through, I'm like, yeah, these are really important. And so the project began to turn and shape based on the information that I was finding on these mutual aid societies. I think also really importantly, it was looking at, these organizations were looking at an earlier period of Caribbean immigration than one in which we're used to speaking about. Often when we talk about Caribbean immigration, we talk about that big boom of Caribbean immigration that occurs after 1960. But I thought it was really important to look at this earlier period because one, it was establishing that Caribbean people were here. The first organization that I found was established in 1884. So there's a record of a group of enough Caribbean people that they want to form an organization. And so I thought that was really important. And so the project just kind of like spiraled from there, finding as many of the organizations as I could, seeing what they were doing, seeing who they were hosting, who they were working with. It just all seemed really important to me. And then looking at the ways in which they turn, for me, it seems like from immigrant like welcoming organizations to becoming really politicized and radical in themselves, and having politicians who are canvassing at their meetings, for them having many of the members go on to become politicians themselves or to become community leaders and organizers. So it's like, oh, these organizations served a variety of purpose for Caribbean immigrants and were really, really important for how they established themselves and made community in the US.
Okay, so I think you've talked a little bit about this, about how the identity of immigrants change as they originally identified as their country and then eventually got absorbed as Caribbean American, and then there was for those Afro-Caribbean, there's also the Black American experience that they may sometimes be grouped with. And we have a question about how that associations happen, where first they're identifying island by island, and then are there organizations that drew in members from multiple countries? I think you did touch upon some of that, but if you could explore.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and one that I do address in the larger work in the book. So many of the organizations, so at first, particularly that early organization that I mentioned, the West Indian Benevolent Association of New York, because there are like 5 or 10 members, they are just pan West Indian, and so they just call themselves West Indian. They're identifying with this commonality of being part of the British Empire. But as we see the organizations start to, as we see immigration start to pick up in at the turn of the century, in the 1900s, we see the organizations are very island focused. And so you have the Trinidad this, or the Antigua this, or the Bermuda or Barbados this. And so they tend to follow that path. But as Caribbean immigrants become more settled in the US and the organizations, there become more of them, they become more extensive, then we see the organization names start to change. And even if the name doesn't change, the requirements for membership change. So some of the earlier organizations state things like you have to be of Antiguan descent to be part of the organization. But then they start to open that and they say anyone from the Caribbean can join, anyone who identifies can join. And then we also see organizations that begin to develop in the 1920s that start to just have United Caribbean-ness, or West, it wouldn't say Caribbean, they usually say West Indian, like United West Indian Mutual Aid Societies, Caribbean Benevolent Association. And so the organizations themselves began to become more pan-Caribbean. And so that's part of the argument that I'm making, that these organizations and having them in the US help them begin to identify themselves as this collective Caribbean identity that they didn't have before they came to the US. So for many of the people who are coming, so someone from Trinidad probably had never met anyone from Jamaica until they migrate, right? Because they're pretty far, not far, but pretty far from each other. And so they're meeting for the first time in the diaspora and then recognizing the shared commonalities through these groups.
And can you talk about what you may have discovered about how race interplayed with this? Because I'm thinking of how there might be Afro or Indo-Caribbean folks in the same nationality, ethnicity, and how did that interaction play out in the United States?
Yeah, so we don't, in the earlier groups, because of the period that I'm looking at, 1890 to 1940, there isn't a lot of Indo-Caribbean migration to the US just yet. And so there isn't really any kind of culture, there aren't any issues there. There are some Hispanic mutual aid societies that are mixed in terms of their racial makeup. And there are also some French, I found the records of 2 French organizations that are similar. It's the French Mutual Aid Society, French Caribbean Mutual Aid Society. And so those are racially Black, but the Hispanic ones are a little bit more mixed, and they tend to segregate themselves between white Hispanics versus Black Afro Hispanics. And so that's where we see the separation. But in this group that I'm looking at from the Anglophone Caribbean, they tend to be very largely Black organizations. And I think this is as a result of the friendly societies and this practice of friendly societies that were established post-emancipation in the British Caribbean.
Okay, and also looking similarly, I'm thinking about the intersectionality of gender and race, and I see a lot of women leadership in the Caribbean societies. I'm wondering if that's a carryover from their culture, and how did that interplay with other organizations led by other ethnic groups in the United States?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, in many, as I mentioned before, many of the organizations have very large female participation. And this is a carryover from the friendly societies in the Caribbean. Caribbean women just were always very active in these organizations. And maybe I would argue that for some of the, in the friendly societies in the Caribbean, some of the reasons were some of the temperance laws that they had. Members were supposed to conduct themselves in a certain way. They weren't allowed, in some of the organizations, not all of them, they weren't allowed to have like public displays of drunkenness, or they just had some certain morality clauses within the organization. And you only needed one member of the family to join the organization in order to reap the benefits of the organization. So in many cases, women would join the organizations, and that would be for their entire family. And so maybe some of that is a carryover. Also, Caribbean women are just known, women were always there. They're always doing things. They're always active. And so this is why we see a lot of female participation. In some of the organizations, the split was 50-50. In some of the organizations, the split was 60% women, 40% men, and etc. In organizations that tended to be male dominated, we would see a women's auxiliary. And so they would have their own separate women's organization, because for whatever reason, they felt like their needs were not being met by the larger group. So they would form their own organization. And how they interacted with other groups, I saw, especially in the organizations. So for instance, there's an American West Indian Ladies Aid Society, which is part of one of these groups. And this covers most of the Virgin Islands, which are now the US Virgin Islands. And so a lot of the membership were from those islands. Those organizations would have a lot of interaction between other African American women's groups. So not necessarily with co-ed organizations, but I saw a lot more correspondence with women's groups to women's groups. Or if there were co-ed organizations, then we would start to see other co-ed organizations. And so I noticed in looking at the correspondence between outside groups and these mutual aid societies, if they were women focused, then only or mostly women's groups would reach out. So for instance, in the American West Indian Ladies Aid Society, a lot of their correspondence were from other African American women's groups, including the Ladies Auxiliary of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porter, and etc. But then in co-ed Caribbean mutual aid groups, I noticed that they would receive correspondence from everyone. And so I think that that's the way I saw them being responded to. If they were women's groups, other women would reach out. If they were co-ed, then everyone would reach out. I think they were very keen on those differences.
And you began your presentation by looking more presently at the numbers around current immigrants from the Caribbean community to New York City. And I'm wondering if you also, there's a lot of discussion right now around mutual aid society, like across generations, there's a present discussion about the usefulness of it and a return to it. I'm wondering if you're seeing any remnants of that or echoes of those earlier mutual aid societies in the present day discussion and activity.
Yeah, I think especially now, in the climate that we're in now, I think there has been a lot of discussion of these mutual aid groups, particularly in the period post-COVID. We saw like that really large boom. And I think one of the reasons we saw the burnout from these organizations is because, so for instance, in the groups that I'm talking about, they were building community. They were building themselves up as a network prior to crisis. Whereas post 2020, these newer mutual aid societies had crisis and then tried to build a community. And so I think it was these older groups are more organic in their formation. And so that's why we see them last as long as they do. Now there are still instances, lots of instances of Caribbean mutual aid societies within New York. Not as many and as plentiful as we have had in the past, but there are definitely some groups that are still in existence, still programming, still having outreach. And I think that's part of the key, is how does the organization evolve with its membership. And so, for instance, I mentioned initially they start off as an adult groups, but then they organize children's auxiliaries or like a juvenile group to keep participation up. And so I think that is a key to their success and their longevity is continuing to serve the needs of its membership. Because once they don't serve the needs of their membership anymore, then people won't find them as useful. Unfortunately, we don't have as many as we have had in the past for that exact reason. Members, one, are no longer appealing to a younger generation, and they depend on younger membership in order to keep the groups going, in order to pay for the buildings that they had or headquarters. Also, a lot of people are being priced out of living in New York City. And so many of the Caribbean members of the organization have to move outside of New York. And this is before the days of Zoom. So they couldn't have Zoom. They couldn't participate via Zoom. And plus, you want to participate within your community that you live in, of course. So that was a problem. And then just our overall attention span. These organizations were before we had TV and social media. And so many of them would be part of like 5 or 6 of these organizations. Not to say that they didn't have anything to do. These people were working 50-hour shifts of work every week, but still making time for these organizations because they found them really important. But it was something they did in the little bit of downtime that they had. Whereas now, I don't think we are as participatory in these outside things. So I think one of the keys to the longevity of these organizations is continuing to serve the needs of its membership and evolving with the membership itself.
I do want to ask one question about your book because someone asked if there might be, or if there are any plans for an audio version of the book.
So my book is published through a university press, and they don't tend to do audio books. But I can ask. I certainly wouldn't want to read it. I hope someone else would read it. I do not like the sound of my voice, so I wouldn't want to read it. I think you'd like to hear someone else read it, but yeah, I can certainly put in some requests for audiobook, but not currently, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'll turn it back over to Monica.
All right, great. So this was extremely amazing. Thank you, Dr. Maddox, for taking the time to share your research on Caribbean American immigrant experiences with us. It was great to learn a little bit more about the impact Caribbeans have had on New York City and its society. I know for a fact that I definitely learned a little bit more today. And thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon. For more information on Dr. Maddox and her books, please click on the links posted in the chat. We hope to see you next month for our July 22nd Lunch and Learn, Destination City. And thank you, everyone, and be sure to stay cool.